I'm very proud of this. It's actually the Albanian Oscar. It's the only useful award that anybody's ever won. It's very nice of you to come. I accepted the invitation long after most of you. When I heard the quality of people, so many old friends, and so many people I've never met at all, which is always very exciting, but have admired from further away than this. And if I don't recognize you at once, you must forgive me. Hello, Tom. I'm extremely long-sighted. And it's wonderful to be in England, which I appreciate perhaps more because I'm not here all the time, and because I only arrived here in the first instance by chance. My mother was 8 months pregnant when we arrived at Harwich. We arrived, I was traveling as extra weight, and I should have been born in Holland. But I was born in London. My mother was so unacquainted with England that she couldn't understand on the trip from Harwich to London why every station was called Bovril. And we arrived just in time for me to be delivered here. And so my regard for England has always been that of an extremely friendly foreigner, but one who feels more at home here than perhaps anywhere else in the world. I say this because my real concept of the essence of Englishness came when my mother told me a story. My mother was a painter, and she designed the interior of Covent Garden and the ballet for the state visit of President Lebrun in 1938 in order to celebrate the Entente Cordiale. And she was selected, together with Dame Ninette de Valois and Constant Lambert, to be presented to Queen Mary. She knew nothing about that kind of protocol or etiquette. And she was told that she must not change the direction of her eyes, she must look directly in front of her, and only speak when she was spoken to. So she stood in the front row with the three of them, with the two of them, she was the third. And Queen Mary swept in, as I had seen her on one occasion in Harrods, looking very much, Ted, like a magnificent ship in full sail, and accompanied by one of the elderly ladies who lived in Hampton Court, a Grand Duchess, Pless, Nassau, Coburg, Gotha, and Wittelsbach, with a tiara, and she was really very, very small, and Queen Mary was this majestic person. And they arrived opposite Ninette de Valois, and my mother stood rigidly like that. And Queen Mary said something like, "You often find you have yes, and Ninette de Valois said, "No, we haven't it." Everybody's here for the gentleman. Yes. On the home. And then my mother sensed that Queen Mary was moving one closer to her. And Constant Lambert was a huge man who drank rather a lot, and who was always slightly sidelong. And she still looked rigidly ahead, not daring to see what was happening. And she heard Queen Mary say, "And you, I found you the last minute." And Constant Lambert said, Then there was was a pause, and Queen Mary landed in front of my mother. And she looked at her and said, and left. So the Grand Duchess, caught between her desire, need to follow Queen Mary and to say some sort of consoling word to make up for this absence of any communication, just had time to grip my mother's wrist and say, "What a pity about the revolution." So that's a certain aspect of Englishness which I've always found very attractive. And another one is that this country is still very, very full of surprises. There was a visit to England the other day from a Dutchman who had lived a quiet and sheltered life and produced the definitive book on the painting of Peter de Hoogh, of Dutch interiors, quiet women sweeping floors and yachts in the background and windmills and occasional cow and everything, the very epitome of peacefulness. And this man was in his early 60s, and he had occasion to be invited to a ducal house by a mutual friend of the Duke and of his in England. He arrived there, and to his horror, having written the definitive book, which was now published in magnificent coffee table style, with all the paintings that Peter de Hoogh had ever painted, he suddenly saw two new ones on the wall that he had never seen, and he got terribly excited and said to the friend, "But I think these are by Peter de Hoogh." And the friend said, "By whom?" "By Peter de Hoogh." He said, "Well, you better ask the Duke." "How does one call the Duke?" "You call him His Grace." "Thank you very much." And he went and said, "His Grace, these pictures are by Peter de Hoogh." "Are by what?" "Peter de Hoogh." "I don't know. I don't know what they are, really." "That fellow's painted on wood, of course." "I know that, because when I was younger, I used to throw a ball against it. And it had a very true bounce. But the other one, probably the other one was in the other wing before the fire, but I don't remember it at all. At all. You want me to call for the black book, and then I can, you see, they have tiddlywinks on the frame. Look very carefully there. And you read me out the number. And I'll tell you what they are. That would be very wonderful, His Grace. And the butler appeared this size. "Bellamy, the black book." Came back with it, and the Duke "Have you got the numbers?" He said, "Yes, they're 104 and 106. "Oh, I wonder what happened to 105. 104, yeah. What did you say they were?" "Peter de Hoogh." Full marks. "What is that, German?" No, it's Dutch." I beg your pardon. "It's Dutch from Holland." "From the Netherlands." Once more. "From the Low Countries." "Oh, the Low Countries. How very interesting." And he was about to shut the book when the Dutch expert said, "Could you tell me where you acquired them?" "Where we what?" "Where you acquired them." Yeah. "Oh, yes. We bought them from the artist." That's another aspect of Englishness. I'm told that I should provoke you into asking questions. I'm rather chary of starting too soon because I only have about 14 answers. But if any of you feel moved to shift me on to somewhere else, I would be personally frightfully grateful. Yes,
you have to travel all around the world, meeting very important people, and each country has its own particular versions of protocol. How would you distinguish and describe the different countries that you visited in terms of their protocol, and how do you cope with it?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, because there's a charming incident in Yugoslav protocol. There was a huge gentleman who was unfortunately killed in an air crash. The Prime Minister under Tito, called Mr. Bjedic, a Mohammedan from the middle of Yugoslavia, and who was a comrade of Tito's up in the hills during the war, inseparable bodyguard. And he was eating at a banquet next door to the American ambassadress, and Tito on the other side. And he was explaining details of the partisans to the American ambassadress, and went, and on the fourth day, they were attacking, and Tito noticed that and said, Bjedic. When the two divisions were already, they were, Bjedic. And I was coming together in a clash. Bjedic. Knife. Who? There was a wonderful clash of protocols at the giving out of the Erasmus Prize, which was won in The Hague by Ingmar Bergman and Charlie Chaplin. I had to go and make a speech for Charlie Chaplin at his request, because he said he was too shy. Well, I'm just as shy as he is, but I did it because it was not for me. It was much easier to make the speech. But I was the warm-up man, because as soon as I'd finished, he got up and he spoke for a very long time. But I remember Queen Juliana, who was very short-sighted, and a very charming lady, who suddenly didn't see the Swedish emissary anymore because Ingmar Bergman couldn't come himself, so that it was somebody from the palace who came. And she suddenly said, there was a lady here before, and the woman was down there in the deepest curtsy you'd ever seen. And I was standing next to her, I tried to indicate she was on the... A terrible shock. Queen Juliana got a terrible shock and said, please stand up. And the woman stood halfway up and said, it is done this way in Stockholm. And Queen Juliana said, well, when you are in Rome, you must really do as are doing the Romans. It's not done here. Stand up. And the woman shot up. And Queen Juliana, whom I'd never met before, took me aside and said, I hope I haven't hurt that woman's feelings. But you know, I hate being treated as though I'm something different from everybody else. They also think that I'm narrow-minded. How can I be narrow-minded that have had nearly every meal in my life in a room with 8 famous Rubens paintings in it?
You know the White House well. Have you met the Reagans? And does Nancy Reagan run things as we're told she does?
Well, we were at the White House, and I have no compunction in telling you about this because it was in all the papers, but we were actually there at the moment when suddenly there was a little... I was at the same table as Nancy Reagan and a very sculptural ballet dancer of great talent called Suzanne Farrell, who, like many ballet dancers, give the impression of being remote and choreographic. Forgive me. You know what I mean? It's sort of unattainable and wistful. But she was a very good conversational friend. And suddenly there was a bing, 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 and Reagan got up and said,
just want to raise this glass of mine in this White House of ours to welcome the Prince of Wales and his lovely Lady David.
And suddenly I felt a grip like that. It was the ballerina who suddenly, as though I was a runaway motorbike. And she said, "What did he say?" And I said, "Don't worry, he's thinking of next weekend at Camp Diana." What was perhaps a little more disturbing was when 12 o'clock came and we started drifting out, and I said to my wife, "I think we'd better say goodbye." And she said, "Yes." And I went up to him and spoke very loudly and clearly and said, "Thank you very much for inviting us, Mr. President." And he said, "Well." And I was standing so close to him I couldn't go away without saying something else. I thought. So I said daringly, "You won't remember this, but almost 40 years ago I invited you to dinner in London, and we dined together at a restaurant called Les Ambassadeurs." And he said, "Oh, wow." "Oh, golly." "Which ambassador was that?" I thought of that the other day when we were with the television crew on the Great Wall of China, which is very precipitate. It's a very tiring wall altogether. It's full of people going in both directions. And I met on that wall somebody I'd been, when I was working in Salzburg during the summer, so somebody was conducting next door, and I never managed to see him, Horst Stein. And I ran into him on the Great Wall with all his orchestra, and we conversation. It's that kind of wall. And suddenly I stopped. I was absolutely exhausted, and the camera was going, and I said, "All right, at this very spot, both Reagan and Nixon gave up. They were too bereft of any stamina. There was nothing left at all, either and all." And I'm told that Nixon, when he got here, said, "Well, it's a great wall." And but I felt sure that Reagan had said,
"This great wall of ours, of theirs."
Anyway, it's a most fascinating personality because since the Americans are a grand sporting nation, they love to see a man who can admit he's wrong, and occasionally Reagan does something which are really quite extraordinary and then goes on the air and says,
"I guess I made another boo-boo."
And everybody says, "Oh, God, to be in that position," and oh. I can see, oh, Clive James.
You being such a fastidious and elegant man, I suppose when you were in the army, you were a very neat and disciplined soldier, were you?
Quite right. I think you must have read somewhere that I wasn't. Some report or other. That was the time that I met David Niven, who told me that there had been a general at Sandhurst who was controlling some of these exam papers and not passing people. And he came out with a wonderful remark, which I'm sure that he was too gifted to be a really good general, because he said about one candidate, he sets himself extremely low standards, which unfortunately he fails to live up to. That was another of the saving graces, was the proximity of humor all the time, because we had at that time some of the last sergeants which came in a direct line, I think, from Waterloo. perhaps by way of the Crimean War and Florence Nightingale, but nothing much had altered. And they spoke with this extraordinary accent, which suggested that they had fairly humble origins, but had been near enough the officers' mess to hear certain pronunciations, and they came out with language which was really absolutely bizarre and baroque. I thought I told you. I don't know where that comes from. I never heard it since. But it has so many grace notes in it that it is as complicated as some of the most modern atonal music. Or perhaps the Chinese would understand it better than we, because they have a four-tone language. Oh, 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 oh. And you can say the most dreadful things if you haven't got a musical ear. Yes, it was a consistently horrifying and yet comic experience. We had a sergeant major who was punch drunk and who spent all his time avoiding imaginary blows. And the nearest he could get to my name was Itno. And when we first called into the army, we spent a horrifying first 5 or 6 weeks in billets which was so overcrowded there were 6 of us into the room the size of a toilet. It was really absolute agony. And afterwards we moved to rather more copious billets, although they were freezing. And I met this sergeant major in the street. And he was a man who, as a nervous tick, would say, "Stand up then. Stand up then." Even if you were lying, ready to shoot. "Stand up then." And he came up to me in the street and said, "Morning, Ustinov." "Stand up then." "There's your new billet." I said, "The new billet is much less congested, sir." He said, "I know." More room too, isn't there? So it was always full of that kind of thing. We had a sergeant, aged 28, who had not a tooth in his head, and they put him folded out like that. And the new teeth had been ordered from the Army Dental Corps in 1937, I think, and they had not yet arrived. I mention this for a very definite purpose, because he was a terrible man, and he watched you writing home, and he watched parcels arrive, and used to come in and say, "Any cake?" And you'd say, "No." Once you got wise to this, you said, "No, I got some toffee." And to show that it's always difficult in life to know which are the good moments and which are the bad, because until you make a final assessment, and there's probably no time for that at the end, you really don't know which is which. But he got his teeth in 1942. And the first day he went out on parade, he said, "Squad, ha!" and collapsed onto the ground, bleeding from his mouth, because he'd bitten right through his tongue. So there was a man who was better without his teeth. Dennis.
Peter, you were born in England and started your career in England. I'd love to know how it was that you crossed the Great Divide, jumped over the herring pond, and landed your first Hollywood job.
The first Hollywood job was not done there. It was done in Rome. And it was Quo Vadis, which was then going to be directed by John Huston. And they thought I looked rather corrupt and shifty, and therefore might be good for Nero. And I did a test with John Huston. But that was a period when acting was completely different to what it is today. It was a time when I just appeared not so long before in a film called One of Our Aircraft is Missing, in which Hugh Williams appeared, a very distinguished actor and a father of someone who's here tonight. And he kept watching me the whole time. Every time I rehearsed, I saw him watching me, and he had a face which one could see him watching, so there was no doubt about what he was doing. He wasn't just being himself, his part. And eventually he came up to me and said, "Excuse me, young man, what are you going to do in this scene?" And I was terribly shy and said, "Well, I mean, really, Mr. Williams, I thought I'd do nothing." He said, "Oh, no, you don't. I'm doing nothing." And that was a period when all drama students, I remember them, said, "I've heard how wonderfully Gerald du Maurier offered a cigarette." And everybody tried to emulate this negligent gesture. Cigarette. As though nothing had happened, and yet everything had happened. Because everything was reduced to such a level, the cigarette became tremendously important. Well, I was brought up in that tradition. And here I was being Nero, going absolutely mad, and thinking I was going so far overboard, nobody in his senses would engage me. Especially not if they'd seen Gerald du Maurier offer a cigarette. And all the time, John Huston, who's this wonderful, mischievous fellow, kept saying, "A little more, Peter. Just a little more." Quite mad. Can't be mad. I went way overboard. And they said they liked it. But they said there was a delay of over a year. And they said that they wanted me to play the part. It was now Mervyn LeRoy who was directing it. They wanted me to play the part, but they thought I might be a little young for the role. I said that Nero died at the age of 31. If they waited any longer, I would be too old. They sent me a cable which I still got and cherish, which says, "Historical research has proved you correct." I think that was because they'd always seen Charles Laughton in the role, who was much older in outward appearance, although he wasn't at all old. But I think maybe he should have done it. Jackie Stewart?
Peter, it's a long time since you did the Grand Prix of Gibraltar as a long player. Perhaps you might tell us how it came about and maybe reminisce a little of some of the voices and why you did it.
Well, I did it because at the time I was very interested in motor racing. Since you left, I'm less interested. So I think it's a very good reason you left. I approve of that heartily because it's good to see you there. And you've now become a very good commentator. I teased you about this before, but I can't resist making it public. Quite apart from the record, which is out of date because it's a long time ago. But Jackie, I've heard commentating on motor car races in America or Canada, and he does a wonderful job, except that occasionally you hear him say, "Oh, I don't like the sound of that engine." And then he says, "And one thing to notice about this very difficult around the houses racing that they're doing here is that you've got to keep off the pavement as much as possible." Here's young Forsyth coming round again. He happens to be in the lead, but I don't think he'll hold it for long. He's gone up on the sidewalk again. The back axle's not going to take this kind of treatment much longer. I can tell you that. He'll be retired before long. There's Forsyth again. He's strangely enough still in the lead. And then right at the end, you hear a rather crestfallen Jackie saying, "Well, young Forsyth won his first Grand Prix, but I think he must account himself a very lucky young man."
Yes. You have a piano on stage. Does that mean that we're going to hear you sing and play?
No, we have not for a minute, but we have I have an old friend sitting in the audience called Tony Hopkins. not the one who's playing Lear tonight, the composer, and he wrote the music for 2 or 3 films I did and many others. And we used to have fun improvising in the style of various composers. And we thought we'd do it tonight, really, very daringly, because we haven't done it for many years.
Oh, wow, golly.
Which composer? Tell me. This is under the general title of Going into Europe, the kind of cultural musts that we have to accept these days. I'm here from the Allgemeine Musikschule in Bonn, and we are going to give you one of the rare pieces of Schubert. Schubert wrote this when he was ill. Based on a poem by Eichendorff, The Girl and the Halibut. The girl is wandering through the countryside, fairly near the sea, and she sees a halibut. And she says, I'm hungry, I want to eat the halibut. The halibut answers, don't do this, please. Because if you do this, you will be ill. Like Schubert. And the girl doesn't listen, she eats the halibut and she's ill. Ein Fräulein auf der Meer, ein Heilboot in das Meer. Und sagt, ich hab Hunger, ich will dir fressen, jawohl. Ich will dir fressen, jawohl. Da sagt der Heilboot, ja. Oh Gott, nein, 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 fresse mich doch nicht. Ja, werd ich dich fressen, das Mädchen da erscheint. Ich will dir fressen, ja, das Mädchen erscheint. Dann kam das Mädchen, ja, und fraß den Heilboot von den Meeren, den Heilboot von der Meer. Sie hatte schon schlechtes Bau, der Heilboot war in der Heilboot war in ihr.
On Mastermind recently, we had a question about the nickname that your father enjoyed when he was a Secret Service mole at the German embassy. I think it was Dumpkopf or something like that. But as a result of that, I've had a letter which reproaches me for being a foreigner in Britain who had absorbed the British inability to pronounce foreign names correctly. However, better than Ustinov, he says, who can't even pronounce his own name properly. I'd like to ask Sir Robin, is that actionable?
I can't make a bow tie of it.
Is that actionable? And secondly, which subject would you choose as a specialised subject in Mastermind?
Oh, God. I don't know. Iceland, I think. To make you feel at home. Not bad. They've got a great sense of humour. There was their Nobel Prize-winning author, Haldar Laxness, who was driving from his farm in a jeep at the age of 66, I think he was, when he was driven off the road by a truck. And he ended upside down in a ditch, still at the wheel of his car. And when the truck driver ran over to him upside down, he said upside down, "And is there anything else I can do for you?" You wanted to say something.
I remember a delightful character who was a dresser of yours in Brighton.
A dresser who was very, very old. He was 88 or something, and he was terribly nimble, and you couldn't hear what he said half the time, but he said, "I'm one of the constables of Gloucester." I thought he meant he was a policeman. Apparently that's a famous tribe of jockeys. And he said, "I was 6 stone 8 when I was 21 years of age. How heavy do you think I am now?" I said, "I have absolutely no idea." 6 stone 8. That's funny, isn't it? And it was the first night. I'd never appeared in that play before. It was opened in Brighton. And I had a little transistor radio with me, which was probably a Volv radio in those days. And just before I was going on the stage, I left it on. Just before I went on the stage, he stopped me. And he said, "May I ask you a question, sir?" I said, "Yes, but hurry, because I can hear my cue." On the first night, it's really quite agitating. He said, "In your long career, sir, have you ever had anything to do with mules?" I said, "No, I've never had anything to do with mules." He said, "It's a great pity if you don't mind my saying so. It's a lovely animal. Christian as a dog if you treat it proper." Then I had to go on the stage. And I came off, and the music had changed. They were now playing Elgar's Second Symphony, which is a very Edwardian and fruity piece of music. The full orchestra employed nearly all the time, and he was listening to it, and he suddenly looked up and said, "Oh, you're back here. Piccolo, that's a fast instrument, isn't it?" And he had a tragic circumstance at home because he said his wife wasn't talking to him anymore. It's very alarming when the people at 80 don't talk to each other. Well, you know, it was during the war, near the end of the war. And I don't know what it was. I fancied I heard a buzz bomb. And I threw myself on my wife in the street. And she never forgave me. There wasn't no bomb. And I can never explain it to her. It's a very sad story, I think. Very sad.
Years and years ago, I was in Hamburg and knew people at the Hamburg Opera at a time when you just directed The Magic Flute out there. And after you left, the production obviously changed and developed a bit in its own ways. I wonder what you feel about actors and singers ad-libbing and adjusting the production, and have you ever been guilty of doing this?
Oh, yeah, when the director left, yes. When I was the director myself, rarely. But Hamburg had a special character. Every time anything went wrong in Hamburg, you knew who it was, and you looked into the wings, and you didn't even have to see the man. He came out sheepishly and said, with a very strong Austrian accent, "It was my fault again." And he said, You said to him, I can't remember what his name was now, but I said, again you. He said, yes, you know, this is a temple of German efficiency, and I'm Austrian, and they keep me on because I humanize them. But however efficient you are in opera, things always can go wrong. In other words, you have to rehearse everything. Because one day in Siegfried, one of the pallbearers was taken ill. And as all the extras were leaving, the man in charge of them said, Hector, don't go home. Why, I'm not on tonight. You are on. Stresebach is ill. So, you will stay and you will go on with Schmidt. Take Höpke here. Show him, tell him, don't need to go on the stage. It's too easy. All you do is to go on. And when the Siegfried is dead, you pick up the and out. But look solemn. Always look solemn. So Schmidt said, it's easy. Come have a beer. We discuss this. Fit the clothes. All we go on is put and then you lift. And it's easy. So they didn't rehearse. And Siegfried died, was lying on his thing with the horns and wings. And the two men went on, and they picked it up facing each other. And with both wishing to save the situation, they put him down, both turned out. If you want to do a thing badly, you have to try harder than Oh, Ted Heath.
I suspect that if you weren't so intelligent and hadn't been born so well endowed, you would like to have been a politician. But tonight you've been rather shy about these questions of East and West. But in your own writings, and because of your experience, you're really in a unique, you've shown that you're in a unique position to interpret East to West, mankind generally. What is your philosophy of humanity? You abandon dogma, and you put humanity in its place.
Well, I'm very flattered and honored by the question from someone who one always expects is going to talk about politics, but when you visit him in his home, you are first of all shown the piano, and then pictures of yachts. And this is the kind of politician I trust. The question is a very complicated one to answer in a short time. But I think, of course, that the media concentrate on what separates us for obvious reasons. And once you've accepted that there are differences between us, one is always struck by the similarities, because conditions are exactly the same. Because if you're sitting with your own family on the other side of the Iron Curtain and you ask for the salt to be passed, and it is passed, you don't think for a moment that it may be a bug or that there's anything subversive about it. It seems absolutely normal. And of course, normal people in the course of daily events don't talk about politics very much, not as much as politicians think they must. And so it doesn't become a burning question. I think what's happening in Russia today is tremendously exciting. I don't want to appear to be enthusiastic, because you fall into another trap then. And as one French paper said to me, are you sure that you weren't charmed by Mr. Gorbachev? And I said, I'm really no more affected by the fact that he calls me by my Christian name than I am by the fact that de Gaulle, in his goodness, once called me Monsieur. I think they're tremendously exciting times when, especially in a society like that, which still bears the residue of Stalinism, or the habits of what happened in between, as in fact any organization must. What Gorbachev is doing really, without abandoning the aims of communism, he's gone back to Lenin and is trying to do what Lenin might have done if he had lived longer. In other words, in Christian terms, he's gone back to Christ instead of stopping at Alexander Borgia or Richelieu for his inspiration. And I think that is extremely refreshing, but he's an extraordinarily engaging man, and he's one of a whole team, because the others are just as extraordinary. And I was told, I remember, when I was working on a big television project by all sorts of scientists, that the Russians could never afford computers in schools because they couldn't rely upon the source of information. They couldn't exclude things. Now I got there to find the first Russian computer for schools, not only operating, but linked with schools in Bologna and Boston, and exchanging information by satellite. And I was asked whether I knew of any English or Scottish school that would like to attempt the experiment with the other three. Well, and they've also got on disk the whole of the Encyclopedia Britannica, not Sovietica, Britannica, and all of Greek and Roman literature, for example, with all the footnotes by learned men. I think this is a fabulous step forward, and one which I never suspected would be possible. But evidently it is. So my philosophy is watch each other like hawks by all means, but don't continue with this abrasiveness and malice which is shown by some people in what they say and think. It's time that Russia was treated as a country like any other. So it's a different way of looking at things, but basically people everywhere are really very good, I think, and they are only made bad. Well, I think we've reached about the end of a lot of people's tethers. I thought I would send you off perhaps with a last touch of European culture with Professor Dengwald, who is here from the West Germany, the Bund für Europäische Zusammenarbeit. And in order to perform for you with the Bonner Kammerchor, nein, doch nicht. Ja. And the orchestra of the Stadt Kassel, a work written by Johann Sebastian Bach at the age of 2 years, or perhaps even some years before that. It's a fragment of a cantata called Sacra, which was found in Erfurt and smuggled from the and I received the manuscript in my Museum der Musikwissenschaft der alter Zeit, Pro Musica Antica, which is, as everybody knows, the museum which houses the largest collection of musical fragments in the world, perhaps even in Europe. Ach, lieber Gott, sei doch nicht sei doch nicht bös. Oh, sei doch, oh, sei doch nicht, oh, sei nicht bös.
Excellent. Well, coming next on ITV3, our Friday night movie. Tom Cruise meets the autistic brother he never knew he had. Dustin Hoffman co-stars in the Academy Award-winning Rain Man.